I'm Jeanette Keynes from Jewelry Arts Inc. And this is How to Make a Bezel Ring Part 8. I'm going to go through all those important prep steps that get everything just right for getting ready to bezel set our stones.
What's that? So you can take a look right here. I put my little pebbles of jett-sett in the hot water, and you see how they get really good and hot like that, and then they look like fish eggs, basically. They look like that. So usually what I do is kind of fish them out, pop it in a little cool water so I don't burn my fingers. And I'm just gonna make like a little plug. Now it's really important that you put it in here and close it before this becomes completely opaque so that it actually molds to the shape and really holds it well. And this is what I mean about when you start squeezing this shut. You see how it wants to climb over? How it wants to like cover up the bezels? We don't want that. So I'm gonna open this up. I'm gonna close it a bit. And usually I just take a wood dowel or really almost anything small, dip it in a little water so that the jett-sett won't stick to it as much. And you see what I mean? Like press it away from the bezel a little bit so that I will be able to actually set. Because if this fills up all the way to the top, we won't be able to get in there with our setting tool. But remember, if this cools off too fast and we don't, you know what I mean, something is not the way we want it, we'll just stick it right back in the hot water for a minute or two, soften it up, and reshape it a little bit. So don't panic. You see what I mean? As you push it, it wants to just climb up in there, which is very naughty. So at this stage, I'm kind of I keep spinning it to make sure that it isn't squeezing up anywhere a little bit. I can also then, take the whole thing and dunk it in a little cold water just to kind of, hopefully speed it up a little bit. Okay, so I'm just going to squeeze it a tiny bit more like that, not hard, and then just let it become completely opaque. Once it's opaque, it's like rock hard and we can start setting. And then we'll squeeze this actually like tight, you know what I mean, and do our whole thing. But that's the process for getting this ready. Jett-sett is so great for setting because it's nice and tough, and it's easy to get out with hot water. It's like endlessly reusable. It's really great stuff. What we used to do before we knew to use jett-sett is we would take a dowel and like wrap tape around it and try to just, shove it on there. And I mean, you can imagine about how well that held. So sometimes the little things really make all the difference. Yeah, exactly right.
I wonder how so in the ancient world they were doing the dowels and the tape.
Or whatever they were using, yeah, or pitch, whatever, right? So I'm just showing a little like close-up of the view there. And you see how as it's cooling, it's getting more and more white and opaque. So I'm gonna give it a couple more minutes till it's completely opaque, tighten it up. I'll mop off any extra water. We'll find the number 1 and the number 2 bezel that we scratched the 1 and the 2 inside so that we know which direction, to go in when we start setting. And then we'll be ready to set. So we found bezel number 1. And what we did, not super legibly, but we just made a little scratch on the inside, number 1 and then number 2, so we know which direction. You don't have to do them all, in other words, but you need to do more than just one, or else then you don't know which direction you go in. If your stones are very different sizes, you may be able to figure it out, but it can make you insane to try to go back and fit and whatever. So important tip, which I'm not sure we discussed back when we were soldering them down, but very important to know where your stone setting starts. So we got the little water out of there, and we were talking before about like, okay, everybody thinks stone setting is just like, well, how high do I need it to be? But that's a little different with each stone. Like these are cabochons, and generally speaking, 1/3 in and 2/3 out, but that's just a general guide. You know, each stone is a little different. You notice like this is a little curvy on the bottom. So you have to accommodate for that. There's just, you know, so generally speaking, what I was saying before, we guesstimate, we put some stuff in there, we stick the stone in, and then we see what we see, and we make adjustments as we need to. Because it depends like what the slope is on the side. You know, a stone that's really straight up and down on the side will have to be lower in the bezel to be adequately held than one that has a nice slope. So it's a lot of ways to just say we have to do it and look at it and see what we think each time. So what I did do, because I know we're gonna need to raise this a bit, is I got some, I think this is 16 gauge fine silver. So I'm just gonna make like a little oval and stick it in there as a little platform. You do that when you have a curved bottom to keep it from rocking. Because you know, if it has a little tummy in there, it can kind of rock back and forth. So this is like a little thing to hold it up. And that's way too big. Jeez, get it together, man. So these are studio, pretty shitty nippers, but they'll do the trick. And usually when I make these little guys like this, like I'm not gonna solder it shut or anything because it can't really go anywhere. It's just gonna sit on the bottom. And, you know, kind of put your finger there or something, you know, because those little things ricochet out of there, like at surprising velocities sometimes. I might have to trim a little more out of that one. Yep. Then I'm gonna squish it flat. Just remember, like anything that goes inside there to hold up the stone, it has, like it's half of its job in life is to be flat. So if you put it in there slanted, it's not gonna do it. It's hard enough to get those little bastards to sit flat without having crooked stuff underneath. Whee! Let's see. Ooh, these tweezers have been through a little action, huh? Okay, still a little bit big. This is an action sequence. How many times can you watch me cut a little bit out of the same link?
That's what it takes.
Yes, sadly, it is what it takes. Still a little too wide on the side.
A little more oval there.
Well, at least we're showing a realistic view of what doing this is like. On the bright side, once you've made one, you have a lot better sense of like, you know what I mean, what it should look like, and it will speed up. Okay. See what I mean? So it doesn't have to fit inside there perfectly. It can't be so tiny that it's gonna ricochet around, and it can't be so big that it won't lay flat. But usually I start with that. We're gonna stick the stone in and we'll see what's what. And if that's a little bit too tall, it's actually pretty easy to just pull that out and sand it down a little bit, or you could hit it with a hammer. So this is a little tight, which will not require a little maneuvering, but on the bright side, that means our setting will go quick. Dowels are absolutely indispensable for stone setting. I mean, you know, wood sticks, I use these for everything, but they're hard enough to position it in place and level things out. They won't hurt your stone. So like, I'm always using these. Oh, tighten your vise really tight, or it'll do that. So I'm just trying to kind of force it in there level, one hopes. Is it in? It is. I think we're going to have to sand it down a little bit. The inner bezel, you know, it's a little too high, but now if you have to sand them down a lot and it's making you crazy, we could also then just go down to a smaller wire. But that's why I usually kind of like do a little test run and see, you know, if we have to sand that a lot, then like we'll probably go get some 18 gauge wire or whatever. Small adjustments, you know, fine, but no point in driving yourself crazy. Yeah, so if you, I don't know if you can get a little view from the side. So it goes in there nicely, but it needs to be down in there a little bit more.
So you're saying 2/3 in, 1/3 out?
1/3 in, 2/3 out.
1/3 in, 2/3 out.
But if you pull this up, you see how much of it is down in there? So we just went down in gauge a little bit because evidently I overestimated a little. And that would have required more sanding than we feel like doing. So I'm just going to go down to a little smaller. On the bright side, also the thinner ones are a little easier to shape. Because your stones vary, but they're similar, you know. So there'll definitely be differences from stone to stone, but they're not enormously different. If you do this kind of shaping on the table, you have to put your fingernail on top of it or it will ricochet and take your eyeball out. So,
Okay.
like, okay. I promise it will do that. Make sure it's laying in there flat. Lovely. Lovely. Look at that. So take a look from the side. We may sand that down just a little tiny bit, but can you see the difference? Like you're in the right vicinity. You're in the right vicinity now. I'm gonna sand down, I'm gonna have you sand down the inner bezel a little bit because I want to make sure we've really got enough. But can you see the difference between what it looks like now and
it's really
what it looked like before?
It's really hugged in there. Yeah.
Yep, exactly right. So I mean,
So you still feel like it's a little high.
well, let's do this. Perhaps if Alexis can capture this. What I do once I press it in also is I grab it with the wax and pull it out and look how much of it is in there. Because the bottom of this is curved, I would like a tiny bit more of this down in. Okay? Like I said, you do reach a point where it becomes sort of a judgment call, but I want to make sure that I don't want to cover too much of the stone, but we got to make sure it stays in there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So normally with something like that, I just take a little piece of 400. I'm going to take this and, you know what I mean, real quick. And we'll pop it back in there. The only other thing we have to consider then is something beauteous to make the light bounce back through your stone. So people like to leave their bezels open because they're like, oh, the light will go in. Yeah, the light goes in and keeps on going. Unless it's a diamond, light won't do that. You know what I'm saying? So generally speaking, for a bezel setting, I mean, there may be times where you do something different because of the particular stone you have. Normally what we do, this is what Cellini did, he writes about it in his treatises, you just use something very highly polished behind it. Normally I just take a sheet of thin, fine silver, sand it up, throw it in the tumbler. We also have squares of mylar, which is just incredibly shiny plastic. Because when the light goes in and hits that shiny surface, the light, and that's what makes your stones go like, oh, hello. You know, they kind of, they give you that sparkle. Otherwise, the light just goes in and like, you know what I mean? It doesn't give you any of that. So every stone I set, has something really highly polished. Like some people will use like really thin platinum and stuff like that. Like to me, that's too expensive. Like fine silver is much cheaper, and it's white and it can be shiny. So to me, that works fine.
And so where does that come into play in this
Well,
order?
once we get the height right,
So once you're done with that,
I'll give you a square of Mylar and we'll cut an oval. The Mylar is so thin that it basically doesn't count
exist. Okay.
height-wise, you know what I'm saying? So normally I fuss around with this first because the problem is if you cut the Mylar first and then start screwing around with your inner bezel, you go in, you go out. The more times you touch that little oval, every time you touch it, it gets worse. You know, it gets little scratches, starts to get fingerprints. So normally I just do this. Once we're like, yes, that's the right height, we'll cut our little oval, stick it in and set.
so it's Mylar, inner bezel, stone.
Correct.
But if you wanted to use the fine silver, then you would account for the height.
The fine silver, usually I use 30 gauge, which is very thin, but yes, or you could also just mill it to 5/1000ths of an inch and shine it. Yeah, but the Mylar basically is so thin that it's negligible. Okay, so sand a little bit, we'll get you some Mylar, okay?
And I'll be lucky if I can get one.